Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Jieun Baek. Jieun is currently a Ph.D. candidate, finishing off her doctoral research into the origins and the beginnings of dissent within authoritarian and repressive regimes. And importantly for this podcast, she is also the author of North Korea's Hidden Revolution, how the information underground is transforming a closed society. North Korea, of course, is a highly closeted society when it comes to information. There are tight controls over what kind of knowledge seeps in from the outside world, what people inside the country are allowed to access, and a series of laws on the books that make the consumption of banned information a crime. There are TVs, there are radios, there is access to information, but these things are locked, they are pre-tuned. And anyone daring enough to try and make international phone calls run the risk of being caught by divisions of the internal police that are charged with just this sort of policing. But as Jieuns' books will show us, things are changing. And in many ways, a lot of this kicked off in the mid to late 1990s, during the famine. And there's a wonderful line from her book here that says the famine was in some ways the worst thing, but also the best thing ever to happen to North Korea. Now, of course, this was a huge human tragedy for everyone involved. But it set off a tripwire within North Korean society. People suddenly had to take care of themselves. They were left alone. They were no longer provided with the basic needs of their life from their own government, from their own regime. If people were going to live, if people were going to survive, they would have to become almost immediately a de facto capitalist society. And from this grassroots marketization, things have changed. More and more North Koreans are consuming more and more foreign information, foreign media, be it through movies, books, TV shows, or simply access to foreign newscasts. They are choosing daily to run the risk, which of course brings with it a whole series of other questions. If so many people now inside North Korea are accessing such information, why aren't we seeing more defections? Why aren't we seeing the seeds of internal revolution? Why aren't we seeing change? There is a cognitive dissidence here that we will get to in this podcast. But there's also a more subtle aspect to this information consumption. Defectors are not just consuming outside information because they are seeking change, because they're unhappy. Often it's because they simply yearn to learn new things, a very human desire. And often the young people inside North Korea are just bored with state-approved media. And of course, any consumption of this type of information has to overcome an existing barrier, that of the ideology and the nationalism that has built up inside North Korea for so many years. For all North Koreans, North Korea is still their home. It's where they grew up. And access to new ideas, no matter how persuasive they are not going to act like a knife through butter here. People are not going to change their behavior overnight. And if they do, they may simply act to try and improve their lives inside North Korea. But there are notable subtle changes happening on the ground. Fashion is changing. Language is changing. And the black markets are pushing it all forward. But of course, on the other side of this are a whole series of NGOs and defector organizations that try to elicit change at a faster rate. The most eye-catching of these are the balloon launches across the DMZ. But there's also the importation of small windable radios, solar-powered televisions, and mini DVD players, all of which are accompanied by micro USBs. The intention of these products and the obvious market inside North Korea for them is clearly a way to get around the existing regulations. And in many ways, as Jieuns will show, this is a better way to influence the minds of North Koreans, to try and bring about change. Grand, large-scale calls for revolution, for people to stand up and risk their lives, just won't work, or at least are unlikely to do so. The new market generation of young North Koreans will need something else. They'll need something more positive to cling to. Something that will make change more appealing and not fall back onto a military option. But importantly, the message in this podcast and the message in Jieuns' book seems to be that change is there, it is happening, and in some ways it seems irreversible. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. On that, and without any further delay, this is Jieun Baek. Jieun Baek, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be talking through the research that you put together for this fascinating book of yours, North Korea's Hidden Revolution, How the Information Underground is Transforming a Closed Society. And there's a lot in this book, and we'll try to get to as much as we can. But just as a start, you have a personal connection to, I suppose, the research in this book and also to North Korea itself. So, and this becomes quite apparent and quite important when we talk to a lot of defectors through your book as well. So I might get you just as a start to introduce yourself and this link that in your family link you have to North Korea.
Right. So I'm American, born and raised in Los Angeles. My parents were born in Seoul, South Korea, and my grandfathers both were born and raised in what is now North Korea, and they both escaped right around the time of the Korean War. And so, and these are linkages that I didn't realize until only a couple of years ago. And it really begs the question, or just this issue of the arbitrariness of birthplace. And so I touch on that in a couple places in the book, but I think it's a theme that's relevant not only in the Korea context, but just, it's a universal theme, this arbitrariness of birthplace, and how where we are born really does dictate pretty much the rest of our lives. And so that's that.
Yep, no, that's a good point, because a lot of the research that comes through your book is going to be defector testimony, and this is really interesting. So it's a good way to personalize the start of this discussion. So a couple of other points just to set the scene here. So as the title of your book, I suppose, infers, this is going to be a lot about information and how information has changed in North Korea. So as a very beginning, talk us through just briefly what the North Korean information landscape looks like, or at least used to look like, and before it started to change in terms of tight controls over information and the restriction for content from the outside world.
Right. So in terms of the information landscape, it is changing. I wouldn't say quite quickly, but it is changing by the day. And so I will go back to, I guess, before the famine, before the 90s, and sort of go from there. So this is a country that has and is very, very a tightly controlled society, beyond what an average Westerner could imagine. And there has been all sorts of redundant systems to control and monitor and watch citizens and just everybody in the country to prevent them from viewing or consuming any type of information that is not expressly permitted by the regime. And this is all really important because the monopolization of information really does and did allow the regime to control its narrative over the country narrative over its people. As we see North Korea go into the famine in the 1990s, this country become with the famine and anywhere between 800,000 to about 2 million people having died from starvation or the effects of starvation, we see the country undergo a massive transformation. Lots of people moving around the country out of just sheer desperate survival, trying to find food and money, people going across the North Korea-Chinese border, trying to make money to bring back to their country. And then we see the first major wave of defection, people permanently trying to escape North Korea, most of those people coming through China and ending up in South Korea. Through that very chaotic, heartbreaking and chaotic period, we see a lot of grassroots markets starting up, and which have now evolved into these massive semi-legal entities. But through that process, we see a lot of information just very naturally moving in and out of the country as part of the process of grassroots marketization and just the movement of people around the country and in and out of North Korea. And so through that, so the 90s, early 2000s, so we see a lot of information just being pushed into North Korea against the government's will. in the form of just natural conversation, with people, with marketeers and traders, 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 across North Korea and Chinese border. A lot of defectors trying to make contact with family members back in North Korea and sharing some stories and just their new experiences living outside of North Korea and so forth. And also we see information being pushed into North Korea through just entertainment and media. And we hear a lot of anecdotes about South Korean dramas being pushed in and so forth. And that is absolutely the case. But also just books and ebooks and news and history books and all these things are being very illicitly being pushed into the country. And I can't underscore enough just how transformative this has been at the very micro level and also at the societal level. So basically, for individuals learning, oftentimes for the first time, news about the world, information about other countries, information about other societies, and very relevantly, alternatives information about their own country. And what that does to someone's worldview of oneself and one's country is, it's very, very, it's a shock to one's system. And
let's talk through that idea of worldview, if it's okay if I bump in there, just because there's a couple of fascinating moments in your book, and just one that comes from the famine. You mentioned in the book, and this is quite a poignant thing to say, that the famine was the worst and also the best thing potentially that's ever happened to North Korea, because it became this catalyst. And when you said this idea that this barrier on information, people inside are just not hearing these two things. There are two ways in which, at least from my reading of your book, in which this information is actually blocked out. One is quite physical. The idea that if you want to make a phone, there are phones being smuggled into North Korea across the border from China, and people making international phone calls. But the North Korean government has things like frequency recorders, where they try and chase down these people, and they put limitations on TVs and radios so they can't be tuned properly, at least to outside stations. But it's also a second barrier that you mention here, and that is the sort of idea that if you grow up in a society like this, you don't begin to question what is outside you. You believe the lies that are told to you. Not so much that you have to simply suppress new ideas, but you're not having them because you are living within this environment.
Right. And, the more I think about this in a non-North Korean context, I think this is not a very shocking revelation, even to Americans and people who live in other societies that have open access to information. Once we become so, whether it's self-imposed or externally imposed by a strong regime, once we become so comfortable in the facts and information and values that we have grown up with, the older we get, we don't want to challenge them. We don't want, and it's very uncomfortable to be faced with information that has the potential to undermine our value system and our belief system, whether it's religious or political or issue-based. Of course, in North Korea's context, it's that taken to the extreme, because people face physical punishment if they not only access foreign information, but have express any view that is not acceptable to the regime. So it's it's something that North Korean people and people everywhere else, can. Let's edit that out. I'm getting a little bit. I'm getting a little bit busy here.
No, I've actually got you there. One of the things that you did mention there, and you mentioned just before as well, is the idea that I suppose in North Korea these are information-related crimes. So this information coming into the country across, I suppose, the border with China, which is in many ways tightly policed, but it's also quite porous as well, and if those things are quite contradictory at the same time. But this North Korea lives in a landscape where information is criminalized. So just before we jump into some of the great big changes that are occurring, how does North Korea, in various ways, police the sourcing of information and the consumption of information?
Right. So if one looks at North Korea's criminal codes, there are explicit information-related crimes, and there's also broader penal codes that can really that someone could be found quote unquote guilty of. That's not only information related, but it is attacking the dignity of the state. It is subversive, countercultural, all of these things. And so one way that's operationalized in North Korea's context, and of course, just for the listeners' purposes, this is not a very law-abiding country, and just because their domestic law says something doesn't necessarily mean that's the way things go. But in terms of information, it is very, very harshly punished. And so one of the ways is, I guess, monitoring. So to basically prevent people from doing it, there are elements. So there are human-to-human based structures. There's also hardware-based structures, software-based structures, and just general surveillance. So anyone who is seen or suspected of consuming illegal information, that person can be informed on to local authorities. That phenomenon of basically snitching hasn't been. It still takes place, but just due to the widespread nature of information consumption today, I think that phenomenon isn't as strictly upheld among neighbors, but that is one way to deter people from consuming information. Basically, there's neighbors always ready to tell on you at the local level. So there's a human-to-human surveillance mechanism, but then also as the country has become more sophisticated from a technological perspective, there are ways to look back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and today, there are ways the country has basically monitored all television sets and radios to not be able to tune to foreign channels or channels that are not explicitly permitted by the regime. That's old news. Like, that's been happening for a long time. What's happening now is the country is developing their own devices, so cell phones. There's many types of North Korean-made cell phones, laptops and tablets and all these things that use North Korean, basically a North Korean version of Linux and Windows software, and Android as well, that has all sorts of tools to try to prevent people from accessing foreign files, and also prevents them from accessing foreign files, but also can identify who is trying to access what type of foreign files. I won't get necessarily into the details of that. There's a lot of interesting work being done on that currently. There's some of that content in the book, but basically people are being watched not only by neighbors, but also on their own devices that the government has made. Now, if people are using foreign-made devices that have been smuggled in, they may have a little bit more wiggle room to kind of evade such a tight monitoring structure and system. But it's definitely on so many redundant levels that people are being monitored and watched, and then once identified that one is not only consuming information but perhaps distributing information to other people, then you could really face a lot of punishment. There was a period towards the end of Kim Jong-il's, so the second leader, towards the end of his reign, his administration, where just information became so kind of a commonplace thing, never allowed, never turning a blind eye, but it just became so common. But then when that some people were saying perhaps the risk level is being slightly, it's decreasing to be watching and consuming foreign information as long as people don't get sloppy with it in terms of covering their tracks. With Kim Jong-un coming into power, the current leader, the third leader of North Korea, information-related crimes has become, the risk has increased tremendously once again. this current regime is instituting all sorts of mechanisms to really crack down on people trying to access and distribute foreign information. It's a very scary thought. I really did hope that the information just got too out of control and people would be able to, that the trends would go down that path. But this current regime is really trying to reverse that trend.
And you did mention just then that a lot of this consumption of media, of course, has to be undercover, hidden, and in some cases hidden from friends and family, not just from the broader community. So as we jump into some of the changes, even if they're not as widespread as we would hopefully see today, the question comes up, of course, why do North Koreans take the risk? And two of the things that came up in your book, at least two of the first two questions, and I suppose these might apply in many ways to younger generations more than anybody else, is there's one thing that you mentioned is the insatiable yearning to learn, which is just I suppose a human instinct to understand more about the world. But another one you mentioned, and this was quite fascinating as I suppose an impetus for change in North Korea, and that is with this younger generation who are simply bored with the information and the entertainment around them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think this is just another human. It's just a universally relevant human trait, which is curiosity of the unknown. And especially for young people, a desire to do something or basically touch the forbidden fruit. And especially when young people are just being hammered with the same news style and the same content and the same music, all the while knowing that there's just interesting content abroad or from an alternative source, that becomes very, very interesting. And when that content, when that drama, when that television show, when it's an alternative news source is actually interesting, one is hooked. And so I think as long as the content being pushed into North Korea is interesting, there's always going to be consumers of it. In terms of meaningful change, do I think foreign information alone is going to bring, structural changes in North Korea that better protects human rights and opens up the country to better protect civil liberties of its people? Not necessarily. But I think it's absolutely necessary to provide as much foreign information, and not just foreign information, but all types of information to North Korean people, to the people who want to listen to it and read it and consume it, to just provide the truth that there are just all sorts of different realities out in this world that they could potentially be a participant of.
Now, you mentioned in the book, and of course, this is I suppose, must be a true phenomenon based on the amount of, I suppose, outside information that is going into North Korea, that most people that do consume foreign media are not defecting. So they're learning about the outside world, but they're not making that leap to defect. And of course, this has got a very famous key word to it in slang these days, cognitive dissidence. And you mentioned it, and I suppose you bring to it a very good analogy. You used the analogy of a religious person sinning, or at least going against their own holy book. And you mentioned the idea of a sin, or the idea that you're not behaving in the way that your religion, or in this case your regime, would want you, does not mean that you immediately throw away that religion or even that regime. And one of the things that you mentioned is that even when some of these defectors do defect and they come down to South Korea, they're still quite protective of their state. They don't like people denigrating North Korea, of course, but they also don't like people denigrating Kim Il-sung in some ways as well. So this cognitive dissidence keeps some people trapped, and I suppose it's an important aspect for people outside to understand that information, as important as it is not going to be a knife through butter moment for people's minds.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one way to kind of make this relatable to myself, as I was writing this book, I wanted to really understand this, not only from a psychological perspective, but just from a very kind of general human perspective. How could someone, when faced with so much information that really undermines one's political views and of the regime and all of this, how can they kind of compartmentalize such different facts? And I was talking to a professor in South Korea, a South Korean professor in Seoul, and he made this amazing analogy that I thought it made so much sense to me. Where if someone, let's take a Christian or a Muslim or someone of any faith, and they do things that are against their faith's beliefs, whether it's drinking or engaging in premarital romantic relations or whatever else. That person, which is pretty much everybody, no one lives. I don't think anyone lives like perfectly lives without any type of breaking away from one's faith. Anyway, they engage in these things that their faith tells them not to, all the while like genuinely continuing to believe in that faith. Or people who just there's just a lot of examples that I also bring in my book to kind of explain how people are really good at compartmentalizing things that are really hard to resolve and really reconcile in their minds, and they just go about their days, just go about their lives, not necessarily reconciling all these different points of tension in their lives. North Korean people, especially people who defect, really have to do that. I can't believe how I can't start to believe how unbelievably difficult that'll be, that process of just trying to reconcile and then just not really fully reconciling different realities, the reality that one grew up in, genuinely believing that that's the way the world is, and then living in a completely different place and being faced with all these facts that the world that you grew up in is not the one that you did. It's not actually true. A lot of it was lie or exaggerated realities. It's an incredibly difficult but common challenge that I think a lot of people who have defected and people who have not defected from North Korea continue to face.
So at the very start, we talked about the famine and we spoke about the economic changes that happen inside North Korean society. And at one point in your book, you mentioned, I suppose, based on the stats, it has to be true that North Korea in many ways today is a de facto capitalist society with a lot of the citizens, despite paying lip service to their regular jobs, getting most of their income from the regular markets. And this in some ways is illegal, in some ways it's not, in some ways it's just not looked upon. It's just sort of allowed to move on as a grey market. But this is one of the important ways, I suppose, in which information comes into the society. You talk about black markets and bribery and how all aspects of society are involved with this. Traders then bribe off the security guards who are then complicit, and everyone seems to be involved in this grey market, this rise of this black market. But information comes in through China, if not directly in this way, but just as basic snippets of information from the outside world that you need to run a business, such as exchange rates or the price of outside goods, for example. And this begins to chip away at people's minds, if not explicitly, but sort of inadvertently.
Right. So I think a lot of the black markets in North Korea that sprung up in the 90s and soon after, they have evolved into these massive outdoor markets and sometimes semi-indoors, and are now pretty much regulated. I think the regime has recognized that, that the public distribution system is just not working. People have figured out a way to fend for themselves, and trying to touch money in the markets, that was one thing that people would not tolerate. And so what were initially like small black markets here and there have now become massive semi-regulated markets that many of them are taxed. The stalls are taxed. The vendors have to go through a registration process. Of course, there are markets that still exist outside of this now regulated system. But it's actually become very much a regulated thing. If one is really interested in learning more about this, the work that Professor Noland and Haggard does, they really go into this in detail, which is fascinating. And so these markets, especially working with Chinese traders and suppliers, people just naturally engage with foreigners, and even looking at what people are wearing. And through these business-related conversations, you're not only going to talk about business. Maybe you'll have chit chat or small talk, and through these conversations with the Chinese businessmen and suppliers, North Korean people are going to very naturally just learn more about the world that these people are coming from, and the world that these supplies and these goods and accessories and clothes and foods are coming from. And so I think interaction with foreigners generally is really, it's generally a net positive for the North Korean marketeers and people who are supplying goods for these markets inside the country.
And if that's a sort of inadvertent way of getting information in, there is a lot of people out there, a lot of NGOs and defectors themselves, and I suppose just well-meaning people trying to get information in quite explicitly, quite deliberately. And one of the, I suppose, the most obvious ways of this, one of the more eye-catching ways, is these balloon launches from South Korea up across the DMZ into North Korea, which of course irritates the North no end. But one of the fascinating things that you put in your book was just what they put in these balloon launches. They're not just dropping plain pamphlets telling the North Koreans about themselves, but they're dropping USBs, US dollars, and pictures of the Kims themselves. So explain what that is all about.
Oh, right. So I think these days, these balloon launches have taken a pause because it has become so sensitive, and just also the shifting political winds inside South Korea. But it's, no pun intended. But that so So in the past, and this is not only into North Korea. Airborne leaflet distribution across the DMZ, they've been taking place for decades. Both ways. My parents and my relatives of our parents' generation, so people born in the 60s and late 50s, have told me that when they were little in South Korea, there would be leaflets coming down from North Korea, and they would find them, and the local police would then tell these little kids, for every 10 or 20 leaflets like these that you find, if you bring them to the police station, we'll give you a little prize, like a little notebook or a pretty pen or something like that. And so this phenomenon is not new, but it's certainly eye-catching, especially these days, because these airborne leaflet campaigns into the north a lot of it is meant to not only be consumed by North Korean citizens, but the act of launching these balloons themselves is meant to attract journalists and bring attention to the issue, which is also controversial. It's a very controversial method among information activists themselves. But putting that issue aside for right now, stuff that's being pushed in, I mean, the options are really endless. I guess the only limiting factor is weight. But other than that, in addition to USBs that are loaded with all sorts of files, a lot of information, a lot of news about North Korea is pushed in as well, just like short facts about North Korea's economy relative to other countries in the world. Just more information about the Kim family and how they are not holy and godlike and not, monogamous and coming from very, very strict Confucian conservative families and so on and so forth. These days, people are getting really creative and trying to push rice and other just practical goods into the country. There are all sorts of actors in this field who try to push information into North Korea, which means there are that many different types of strategies and methods and types of content being pushed in. And some push in information about their own experiences, so a lot of defectors' own experiences living abroad and how wonderful it's been, how confusing it's been, how difficult it's been. A lot of people try to push information of religious nature into North Korea, news, and documentaries, and so forth. And so the options are really endless.
And when they're not launched in balloons, one of the other ways in which information comes in, of course, is across the Chinese border. And as you mentioned before, one of the challenges with getting this information is that radios and TVs inside North Korea are locked onto certain stations. And if you put a DVD in a DVD recorder, it's much easier to be caught. You mentioned in your book that these authorities, they go around late at night and they kill the power to the buildings. So they can come in when there's no power, then turn the power back on and find out what DVD is in the machine, so people can't hide them. But you mentioned some of these ingenious ways in which people are getting past this particular blockade, and 3 devices that you mentioned, which are all quite fascinating to me, that are coming across from China through the Joseon-jok, and that is these small solar-powered televisions, and then small wind-up radios. And one device called the Notel, which I suppose is a very small mini TV that folds down like a notebook. So tell us about the importance of these devices, because they seem in many ways quite backwards technologically, but they are almost the perfect way to get around North Korean surveillance.
Right. So there are just really all sorts of devices that I personally have never used growing up in the U.S., but I come across them when I meet my friends in this field, the activists in this field. So the Notel, it's been around North Korea and China for a while now, many years at this point. And it's essentially a multimedia device. There's a DVD and USB and a radio function along with a screen. So it's very useful. Made in China, pushed into North Korea through just through supply and demand chains, and other type of solar powered devices. So basically, devices that do not depend on regular supply of electricity and batteries and so forth, because of course electricity is not. It's not readily available all the time to most parts of North Korea. And so there are very ingenious ways and just very creative ways people are turning to access the information that they want. Now, it's a constant cat and mouse game between the regime and between the citizens who want to be just accessing foreign information. If you look at any other context, maybe perhaps in Myanmar before they officially transitioned to turning power from a military government to a civilian government, or Cuba or Iran, Eritrea, you see a lot of similarities in how people are just creative in trying to evade punishment and evade the authorities. And so we see that in the form of people turning to devices, people trying to change up their distribution methods, people trying to just basically do what they want to do without getting caught. And so it's an ongoing process. The regime is becoming much more creative and much more sinister in trying to catch people, and not depending on humans, not depending on people, but depending on a lot of higher tech, technologies. It's a ongoing cat and mouse game, for sure.
And one of the things that, of course, is coming through that information, and you mentioned this in your book, that you did a lot of interviews with a lot of defectors, and they would tell you that one of the most important things that they heard across the radio is not so much a call to action, or not so much just the repetition of information, but to hear such information, or to hear just basic information from defectors themselves. So tell us why it is so important that why their voices of defectors going back into North Korea are so important, and just how North Korea sees these people, because over the years there have been a number of assassination attempts and the like on these defectors.
Right. So from the people I've spoken with, I think it also just makes a lot of sense that from a very, very closed environment, an individual will most likely trust someone who's most similar to that person. And if you hear, let's say a British person, not to pick on the Brits, but some British person who doesn't speak Korean, and that radio broadcaster person is being then translated into Korean, and that Korean language is a Seoul accent, not one from Cheongjin or Hamhung or Pyongyang. It's going to be really hard to trust just to trust the authority and the legitimacy of that content, just because it's different from a North Korean listener's perspective, especially when this whole kind of system is based on mistrust. So I think having the voice literally be one of a defector, but also having the stories and the experiences be that of someone from North Korea is really important to really get through to the listener and to really kind of gain the trust of the listener. I don't think this is very specific to North Korea. Of course, these kind of dynamics are much more enhanced in the North Korean context, but I think it's quite it's a very reasonable expectation to have. But I think, kind of more broadly speaking, I think that the experiences, the content, the distribution should really be driven by North Korean defectors if they want to be involved in this process, because they know the most. North Korean defectors know the most about North Korea. They're from there. They're born there, and we should really lean on them for their advice and their leadership in this space.
And one type of information that does go into North Korea, and as you mentioned, I suppose you touched on a different context before, comes back the other way, is this, I suppose, implicit call for revolution in both countries. So there are radio signals that come from the south into the north that say things like "We are the underground" in Pyongyang, just as there are the same things coming from the north into the south with radios like "We are secretly recorded from Seoul." And of course, they're not, but they're trying to imply to the society around them that there is a resistance, there is more people out there that doubt the regime, and there are more people out there, I suppose, at least growing their willingness to stand up. So what do you make of these efforts? Do you see them as very successful?
Not really. And so these type of manufactured attempts to try to basically falsely give the impression that there's governments in exile, like substantive governments in exile that will then try to start a revolution against North Korea. I mean, these have taken place, and maybe some have been some have been bigger than others, the other attempts, but it has not been effective so far. And really, the people that are put at risk the most in these type of efforts are the people inside North Korea who listen to this stuff. So it's super sensitive. I think it kind of points to a larger question that a lot of these information campaigns, they're not just it's not just rosy. There's a lot of different types of content being pushed on both ways, and the motivations could be the motivations vary as well. And so it's a very complicated and very messy and very risky environment. But yeah, but going back to this question of, are these attempts to kind of grow resistance efforts effective? I think so far, no. And we know that empirically because there has been no revolution in North Korea. But I think it's really important to recognize the danger and the risks involved in the information consumer inside the country. Sorry, go ahead.
So one of the things that we mentioned earlier, of course, and of course you are American yourself, is North Korea's relationship with America and with the United States. So it comes across a lot. America tends to give a lot of aid to North Korea. And of course, when North Korea reaches out to the world through provocations or even through peace talks, they tend to be, at least whether they're reaching out to South Korea, they're doing so through America as well. And one of the fascinating things that came about in your research, of course, is many people inside North Korea, of course, don't know about the behavior of the real American behavior. They get this very distorted view. And one of the fascinating things that came across was with North Korean fishermen. And you mentioned that they begin to doubt the stories that they've been told about America as time goes by, based on very small things, such as when they're out at sea, accessing foreign weather reports as opposed to domestic weather reports. Their North Korean weather reports are very inaccurate, but when they get the foreign ones, they're much more accurate. They use them much more, and they begin to get this growing idea that the outside world is perhaps given a more pure or a more accurate, I suppose, information landscape.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that it's really easy to politicize kind of information-related activity, and it is very political because the North Korean government just hates it with true passion. But moving away from that, a lot of the information people want inside North Korea, based on people I've talked to and interviewed, is practical information that makes their lives better, not necessarily to shatter their worldview and try to convince them to risk their lives to defect, but information that'll make their lives inside North Korea better. Things like hygiene and information related to sexual health and women's health and maternal health, information about weather patterns and exchange rates, so that they can turn a better profit for their businesses. And it's a practical information like that. And so I think that if the information consumers want to make bigger inferences about the source of better practical information, where is this coming from? Maybe they have more information. What else can I learn? People can make that inference on their own if they want to, but a lot of the information people do want is just practical stuff that's going to make their lives a little bit better. And so I think a lot of the foreign information being pushed into North Korea shouldn't necessarily be to convince people to defect. That's a very, very dangerous choice, and it's a very personal one, and no one other than individuals should be the one making that decision. So for activists and whoever else, or other people who want to be involved in this landscape or the activism around this, or have any type of influence over the content being pushed in, I think they should really, we should all be very cautious and careful to think about just what are the motivations of the information being pushed in, and a lot of it. Yeah, I'll leave it there for that.
And on that point about information that makes people's lives better, and this is, I really enjoy this point in your book because it tends to make a lot of sense, and you tend not to apply it to a North Korean context. We tend to think in terms of big grand gestures at change and revolution. But you mentioned the simple vision of young people inside North Korea looking at South Korean movies, just taking them in terms of entertainment value, not searching for information, but seeing in those movies romantic scenes. And really what they're seeing is the way North Korean couples behave when they're in love. South Korean couples behave when they're in love. And the sort of romantic expressions that they're allowed to show in public. And this becomes a incredibly motivating drive for people to change or to defect.
Are those scenes motivation to defect?
Yes.
Oh, from my conversations and interviews, no. No, I think what those scenes can do, the impact those scenes have, and we're not talking about anything necessarily racy. We're talking about things like holding hands in public, and South Korean boyfriend like characters holding the girls' bags because it's heavy, and piggybacking them if their feet hurt because they're wearing heels or whatever else. Very kind of sweet scenes like that. These scenes could perhaps influence people's behavior and the way they act in their own relationships, their kind of own secretive relationships, boyfriends and girlfriends that their parents don't know about, or whatever else. But in my experience with speaking to people about this kind of stuff, absolutely not. They have not been a motivation to defect, because if we haven't talked too much about the risks of defection in this conversation, partly because I think the listener, whoever they are, will be very knowledgeable of at least of just the basics of defection. It's illegal from the North Korean government's perspective, punishable by death, and if caught abroad, they're subject to forcible repatriation, especially if one is in China, because the Chinese government is complicit in that. And so defection and also punishable, one's family and loved ones are also subject to collective punishment. And so defection is very, very, very risky and personal and just a big choice that one makes. And so I think that scenes, as lovely and enjoyable as they are, not just romantic scenes, but just movies in general, will almost, just to my knowledge, have never been a sufficient persuasive factor in convincing someone to take that big decision to defect. But they do play a role in influencing one's behavior and perhaps attitudes in their own lives inside their hometowns.
And there is significant behavior on the streets of Pyongyang that are, I suppose, in many ways, visualizations of change themselves, if not. And you mentioned the idea of girls wearing nail polish or girls dyeing their hair, and both things are banned in North Korea, but they sneak these past the authorities. But in more and more ways, people are noticing change on the streets in terms of fashion, behavior, hairstyles, and even very small things in slang where they're copying this South Korean slang or foreign behavior.
Right. I think one thing I'd like to point out is there are, huge differences between Pyongyang and other cities, especially the more rural areas that we get. There's just huge differences. And so there's a lot more leeway, social and behavioral leeway inside Pyongyang, just because it is a city of elites that have much more interaction with foreigners. For example, tourists, journalists, embassy staff, whatever else, and so we see. So that there is just definitely the Pyongyang and the rural divide, but a lot of the kind of traditional bans on fashion and hairstyles that have been very interesting to read about. A lot of it has been kind of softened in across the country, just because people have been accessing this stuff so much. So they have been softened. People still can't, wear whatever they want or certainly say whatever they want. But a lot of these kind of strict bans have been softened. But like you mentioned, consuming foreign media and entertainment certainly does influence people's desire to try to imitate what they see, and it's not specific to North Korea. Everyone around the world does that. We want to look a little bit more like the cool, beautiful actresses and actors that we see on TV or movies. Same goes in North Korea, especially among young people. And as and that may seem like a silly thing to talk about. Who cares if North Korean young people are trying to imitate hairstyles and fashion that they see in movies? It's not a big deal, honestly, if we take that in and of itself in isolation. But I think it's a huge, I think it's very significant in the sense that they're trying to, the attitudes are just so different today versus 30 years ago towards South Korean foreigners. The young people today in North Korea do not view generally speaking, do not view South Korea as poor and backwards and homeless that they were told by the government that they were. The young generation in North Korea is really much more. They have unprecedented access to foreign information. They're much more interested about the world outside of North Korea, and we see that in small behaviors like trying to imitate styles and fashions in what they watch. And so, I guess all of this is to say that the young people and the young millennial, or whatever we want to call it these days, the young generation in North Korea could really, I think, be a source of meaningful change in the country.
And I think it's important here as we get to the end of this interview to sound things off, I suppose, with a look towards the future. So a couple of last questions. So the first one, I suppose, is a challenge and a problem that people have been reporting on for a number of years here. And this is the problem of when people do defect, the challenges of integrating into South Korean society. And these defectors, they have an awful lot of social problems. And it's not just social problems in adapting to a new society, it's also the way that new society looks at them as well. This is a challenge that runs both ways. And you mentioned in your book that at the moment there's about 30,000 defectors in South Korea that are struggling to properly integrate. And the long run in all of this, of course, at least for many people, many Koreans, of course, is reunification. And of course, the stat there, as you put in your book, is if 30,000 defectors are struggling to integrate into South Korea, how are 25 million going to do so?
Mm-hmm. Yes. As wonderful as reunification can be, as a concept, and having all these families reunite and so forth, from forget the economics, forget all of that, not forget it, but kind of putting those considerations aside, these societies are so different. I'm kind of stating the obvious here, and trying to mix and mingle and integrate in a meaningful way 50 million South Koreans and 25 million North Koreans who have all sorts of preconceptions about each other is really, I think it will take a miracle to pull that off in a successful, meaningful way, where most people are happy and productive members of society. That's going to be really difficult. And we see that, like you said, with the 31,000 North Koreans living in South Korea. Of course, not everyone's struggling, and the struggles are different for different people. But it is very difficult because South Korea is just as different as society can be compared to North Korea. And so the challenges are real. And so I don't have an answer. I don't have a solution to that point. But we see a lot of young North Korean defectors in South Korea who are, quite successful in many ways, personally, academically, professionally, and so forth. But I think that there's a lot more that can be done, not only by the government, but among citizens as well. And not only South Koreans, but foreigners like you and me and other people as well, who could really play a role in the process of assimilating North Koreans into South Korean society and other societies. And I think it's not only them integrating into these foreign societies, but also others really acknowledging their value that they're bringing to the table as well. They don't have to, I think this idea that North Koreans have to shed all of their North Koreanness in order to successfully assimilate into another country, whether that's South Korea, the US, Australia. I think that's the attitude that really sets people up for failure, because why? Obviously, I think bringing a lot of ideological things may create a lot of tension, but these are people who have their own views, their own personalities and characters, and I think they should not be expected to shed all of that as a benchmark for success in assimilating into another country. I think we really do have to acknowledge the value that these people bring to the new societies that they're settling into as well.
And as a final question on this, we might look forward a little bit. Now, this whole book has been, this great research has been about information going inside North Korea and the changes happening inside North Korea. So in some ways, it feels like there's an irreversible change happening. Now, I suppose this has been said before in some ways, and it's been said about other authoritarian countries before, but this new generation coming up, this market generation that came about after, or even during or just after the famine years, you mentioned in your book they're capitalistic, individualistic, they're open to taking risks, they are self-reliant, and they have a new relationship with the government. They're more distant to the government. They don't look at the government in terms of the people who should be supplying them with the needs of their life. So Just as a long-term view here, do you see this as, as we mentioned before, a slow march? But do you think this is the march towards change, or is something radical going to have to happen along the way? I know it's a tricky question.
I think it will be a slow march. I think the attitudes that you just shared are irreversible. But I think it's also important to not underestimate how smart, sophisticated, and forward-thinking the North Korean government is. I don't mean this as a way to praise them. I think we need to acknowledge just how sophisticated they are, though. We didn't talk about this much, but basically, not only the repressive measures that they're instituting or reinstituting about information crimes, but this government is trying. They're also changing their own media and entertainment so that they could cater to newer attitudes among young people. And that's just one tiny example of how this government is trying to shift at least the contours of how they interact with their citizens so that it's more palatable and sensible. And in so many other much more significant ways, this government is shape-shifting in ways to really continue to be the one in control of this regime. And so as people change, this government, the core is not going to change, but the way they are able to control and surveil and monitor people are going to change as the people change. So this is just a long way of saying that this government is not to be underestimated in just how far they are willing to go to remain in power over its people. So I believe that the young people will, I believe and I hope that they will continue to, walk a slow march of self-realization and self-acknowledgement and self-determination. But I think at the same time, we should not undermine the North Korean government's willingness and ability to try to change with the generations in a way that will enable them to remain in control. So it's kind of a dark way to end this conversation, but I think that there's a lot of things to be hopeful for, and I hope that we can continue this conversation some other time.
Absolutely. So the book we've been talking through today is North Korea's Hidden Revolution. The Information Underground is how the Information Underground is transforming a closed society. So Jieun Baek, thanks for coming on the Korean Now podcast.
Thank you, Jed.